Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for watching this Wednesday weather update. We've been talking about this quiet stretch of weather. I think that's coming to an end here as we get into Thursday and then Friday tomorrow. If you look down at the infrared satellite imagery just here this morning on the continental U.S., it remains quiet here on Wednesday. So we've been talking about this week on, week off pattern. I think we're nearing the end of that week off, and we're certainly staring down a more active period over the next 48, 72 hours, and then even beyond that out into potentially next week that we'll have to talk about. We'll discuss that. There are some differences right now. The ECMWF and GFS, there's a bit of disagreement in how they're handling the troughing in the western U.S. coming through this weekend, and I think that's changing some of the storm forecasts a bit and exactly where that precipitation is going. We'll talk about that. We'll break that down in just a second here. We'll talk about temperatures briefly at the beginning of this as well, and then kind of the back half of this video, I want to talk about some early signals we're seeing in late May as it relates to some of the drought concern. We just did that deep dive into temperatures yesterday, and I think we're seeing what I'm willing to call the first kind of maybe concerning signal getting into mid to late May in terms of what might be staring us down after really kind of the spring predictability window that we've been talking about in April and early May here. So we'll talk about that at the end of this video. Those are kind of the last slides over here on the right if you are skipping around. At least for today, I want to do a quick recap on the severe weather events. Had some severe hail reports in the mid-Atlantic yesterday. Just a few of these kind of scattered across portions of eastern PA, New York and Maryland. That system kind of exiting off to New England now. I can see some lingering showers here over upstate New York. Otherwise, just looking across the U.S., that kind of that quiet period, it remains with us here this morning on Wednesday. We'll talk about the all hazards map in a second, but I can maybe make out some small returns here in Oklahoma in terms of showers and then across the southwest as well, but not too much to talk about in terms of precip here on this Wednesday morning. If we look at the water vapor imagery on satellite, you can see a few more things to discuss. In fact, if we look to our west, you can see a trough here up over Alberta and Western Canada, another piece of that all the way down here over Southwest California. And it's really kind of how these two interact with each other in the coming days, which is going to determine where exactly we're talking about precipitation and storms as this system wraps up in the central U.S. If we look at the all hazards map valid as of this morning, recording time 6 a.m. Central here. See some red flag warnings in New Mexico, winter weather advisories, winter storm warnings, and portions of the continental divide here. I will say that look with the red flag warnings to the southwest, the winter weather advisories kind of getting into portions of Montana and Wyoming here. That reminds me a little bit of when we had that active period at the beginning of March, or I should say the end of March, and then early into April, where we had a lot of those red flag warnings, some of the dust concerns associated with that, and then the system would get into the central U.S. wrap up, and we'd see other watches and advisories be posted for portions of the central U.S. Or the southeast. So kind of seeing the early end to the quiet period, I think here, even just in some of these early advisories out. In the blue colors here across the Ohio River Valley, portions of the Mid-Atlantic, these are frost advisories. We're kind of getting out of this risk here in the Illinois and Indiana, maybe the central Corn Belt. This is going to persist overnight tonight, Wednesday into Thursday morning for portions of the Mid-Atlantic. If we look at the current temperatures here this morning, you can see kind of prompting that frost advisory risk, getting down into the mid-30s in portions of Illinois, maybe northeast Indiana, northwest Ohio. We don't have a temperature reading over here, but these temperatures certainly getting down into the mid to low 30s at this point. In terms of below freezing, more so up into northeast Iowa, portions of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And then if we look at the forecast for these minimum temperatures, this is for this morning here. These were a little bit too low. If I could take this into tomorrow, Thursday morning, seeing that cold temperature risk shift east a bit, prompting those frost and freeze concerns for Ohio, parts of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, and perhaps Maryland. On the backside of this, we're starting to warm up even tomorrow. So if I jump over and we look at the maximum temperature forecast for today, starting to warm up in portions of the Midwest, certainly the central and northern plains. Tomorrow on Thursday, that activity starts to shift east a bit, even into portions of Ohio. And then by Friday, more widespread warmth across portions of the Midwest and then the eastern U.S. On the backside of the system, seeing cooler temperatures prevail as this low pressure system wraps up. We'll talk about that in just a second here. Now, if I compare these two maps, these are the two forecasts I was talking about earlier, and I'm going to take this forecast and make it valid right here where we're talking. So let's do 7 a.m. Central Time. I'll refresh this. So 7 a.m. Central Time here on Wednesday morning. Now, we just talked about those troughs in the western U.S. If you look over Alberta and British Columbia here, you can see one, what we call shortwave trough, that vorticity maximum here in the forecast kind of centered over British Columbia. This other one, this almost cut off low near California, centered off the coast of California here. Now, if I'm going to compare the two, I'm looking back and forth. They're very close. they're very close right now, but I can actually make out two differences here. One, if we compare, let's call this the northern trough. On the GFS, it's a bit more defined. You can see almost kind of darker blue, sharper colors here. A bit more defined, has a bit more action out in front of it in terms of what we call kind of these convective fingers here, if you're still following. And then further southwest over California, the ECMWF, this one compared to this one, actually the ECMWF looks a bit stronger to me. So the northern trough on the GFS, this one looks stronger of the two compared to the ECMWF. And then if we look to the southern trough, well, on the ECMWF, this one looks a bit stronger, a bit more defined vorticity at the middle of that, where the GFS just not quite as sharp. Very, very subtle differences here, but these matter when we go out into the forecast. And what I mean by this, I'm going to take this forecast into the future here, and I'm going to take it all the way till Thursday, tomorrow evening. Now, if we compare the two again, that signature holds. This GFS trough is much stronger than the ECMWF now at this point, much more going on, much more sharp defined vorticity maximum, has more of those, again, kind of, do you see this kind of convective, these fingers out ahead of it? ECMWF has some of those, but not quite to the same degree. And then the ECMWF, that southwest trough, again, is a bit stronger. There's a sharper vorticity maximum here than over here on the GFS. And that's changing things a bit in the forecast. And what's happening is because this one is a bit stronger, it has a bit more pull to it, kind of maybe more gravity, if you will. It's not the actual physical process, but kind of a good analogy. And that's starting to tug this weaker trough because it has less influence further to the west and southwest. So by tomorrow afternoon, this trough is centered over northeast Nevada, whereas the trough over here in the GFS is centered, more over portions of southern Idaho or northern Utah. Again, extremely small differences just 24 hours from now. But as we get out of the forecast, let's go all the way now to Saturday morning. Because this trough got pulled a little bit further west, it's now centered over northern Arizona, whereas this trough is now centered over southwest Colorado, northern New Mexico. Take this out further, and now there's a bigger difference. This trough here in the ECMWF centered maybe over portions of western Kansas, Garden City, whereas this trough now in the GFS centered over northwest Missouri, maybe even Iowa. So that's a pretty big difference here. This trough from the GFS moving quicker now because it didn't get pulled toward the southwest. The storm system moves through a bit quicker. It's a little bit weaker in terms of precipitation. The ECMWF takes a bit longer to get through because it got tugged just ever so slightly toward the southwest. That allows more precipitation to get in here in terms of moisture return from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's going to change the precipitation profile and the exact kind of storm tracks between these two out into the forecast. So it's just those small differences kind of early on. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of comparing those to reality. And if I look at these two systems here, those were just forecasts. What's actually happening, I think, is kind of the best tool as a forecaster. And if we look, I will say this one up here, this northern stream, it's certainly a trough, but it doesn't look terribly strong to me. And this one down here in the southwest also isn't too strong, but it does look like it has a pretty defined core here in the middle of that, if you can see that. So it's kind of a broad trough here, but it has a nice defined center of circulation here. And we saw a better handle on that than the ECMWF, which is why I'm kind of leaning toward that ECMWF solution, where this one looks a little bit weaker than the GFS maybe advertised, and this one looks a little bit stronger, kind of matching the ECMWF in the forecast. Compare these forecasts together. On the left, the GFS, the right, the ECMWF, so the same respective pattern as before. We see the system finally start getting precipitation down into tonight and then early tomorrow morning in portions of Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. There was some questions on this coverage here early on Thursday morning, but the models have come to some agreement that we will see some potential showers and storms, likely subsevere in portions of Missouri and Illinois as we get into the morning on Thursday through lunchtime. Those shift off toward Illinois, Chicago, western Indiana into the evening hours, and then we're kind of watching and waiting here in Iowa for potential severe storm or supercellular development, maybe in terms of a hail risk. We can see the ECMWF producing a swath of potential severe thunderstorms here in southern Iowa. GFS a little bit weaker. You can see a decent swath of showers associated with this to the north over the upper Midwest. GFS, again, being a little bit quicker with the system, is putting down some more precipitation out ahead of this. So I take this forecast now into 7 a.m. Friday morning. Initial wave kind of moving off into Canada here and waiting for the next development down a little bit further south. So now we're into Friday evening. We're watching and waiting if we're going to see storm development along this front here, stretching through the middle part of the country up into Illinois, Missouri, all the way down through Oklahoma. This is Friday evening. We really see that activity kind of pick up after sunset, so after dark on Friday. Seeing more vigorous precipitation show up in these models here. Pretty good agreement between the GFS and the ECMWF. Potential severe storms on a line over that kind of same Oklahoma to Illinois, Indiana corridor. That activity could kind of sit over the same area for a bit here. This is all the way Saturday morning at 7 a.m. Models still fairly similar here. Notice the ECMWF with stronger snow precipitation here in portions of Colorado and New Mexico because it's now starting to get that more defined, slower low pressure system spinning up here. Activity continuing Saturday evening across that kind of same frontal area, now stretching all the way up into the mid-Atlantic at this point. It is ever so slightly in this forecast now through the weekend moving toward the southeast. You can see now finally we're showing that difference, right, that we analyzed earlier. These seem to be waiting longer to get this spin up here. This is now Sunday at 7 a.m. Central Time. And see this low pressure system spinning up more organized over eastern Kansas, northeastern Oklahoma. Potentially a severe thunderstorm risk is going to develop later in the afternoon, more so on the ECMWF solution, whereas the GFS kind of pushed this diffuse, kind of washed out low over portions of the Ohio River Valley, Mississippi, Tennessee. Can't rule out some severe weather down here associated with this, but it doesn't have the same stronger signal that the ECMWF does. This is now Saturday at lunchtime. We now have a much more defined low on the ECMWF pushing up into western Missouri, whereas the low here from the GFS, it's hard to even define a central low, maybe here over western Tennessee. So on Saturday afternoon, we see a stretch of storms likely firing along the cold front here over portions of Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas. The GFS kind of has this big washed out signal. Again, potentially some severe storms down here, but doesn't look like a huge signal, more so just a lot of precipitation or showers off more so to the east over the Ohio River Valley in the southeast. So this is a pretty big fork in the road in the forecast. We'll see where things come through this morning here as these model updates. My guess is that we'll see kind of a mix of the two, with maybe the corridor of this low pressure system running through the middle here over portions of Illinois and western Indiana. If it caves completely to the ECMWF solution, we could see more activity a little bit further west over Iowa. Now, in terms of excessive rainfall, this is the outlook. We're looking here on Saturday. So with the storms kind of Friday evening, we mentioned potentially picking up after dark and lingering overnight. Some flash flooding concern here over that corridor that we just talked about. And if we just look at the hazards map from NOAA over the next weekend here, this is 3 to 7 days, so covering much of the weekend here. See the severe weather on multiple consecutive days here across portions of the central U.S., kind of underneath that front, and then that eventual developing low pressure system. Heavy rain we just talked about, and then some of the high winds on the backside of this. In terms of the exact precipitation amounts, looking at anywhere between half an inch up through portions of eastern Nebraska, Kansas, getting into the southeast over the next 7 days. But again, this kind of corridor here, North Texas up through southern Illinois, looking at anywhere maybe 2-3 plus inches because of those training thunderstorms Friday night into early Saturday morning. A potential uptick in that activity as we go through the day Saturday, and then waiting on that storm system Sunday to develop to see if it's going to move more so over the Midwest, maybe even Iowa. The GFS brings it quicker kind of through the Tennessee Valley with more precipitation likely getting into the southeast associated with that. So the WPC here, this from the National Weather Service, going kind of in between the two, producing a wider swath of precip. It's not going to look like this when all is said and done on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. We're going to have a more defined area kind of either up here or a little bit bent over here from the GFS. In terms of the Storm Prediction Center, their outlook here, you can see just today kind of waiting on potential thunderstorm development in eastern Kansas, western Missouri overnight. Likely to be sub-severe, but they do have a marginal risk out, so can't rule it out that some severe hail and wind do sneak into this area later today. Tomorrow morning, looking at a better defined risk when we wake up in portions of Iowa, northern Missouri, eastern Nebraska. Again, just a slight risk here, but waiting into the kind of late afternoon, early evening to see if we get supercellular development in Iowa, likely primarily a hail and wind threat associated with that. And then as we go into the day Friday, this is when we're watching and waiting for those potential overnight storms to develop here across a pretty wide area, anywhere from Michigan all the way down to Texas. Again, I think these go late, and these could also have that kind of hail and wind threat to them as well. So you get into the day Saturday, and notice this shifts a bit further to the southeast along that front. Again, the same kind of corridor, just shifted a little bit toward the southeast. And then finally, day 5, this is kind of, we're waiting on that low pressure system to see if it moves more so up into Missouri, kind of leans over more so into the southeast. Now, beyond that activity here, we talked about the rainfall coming in through this weekend. I want to look out a bit into next week because this activity, I think, will continue in terms of systems coming off the continental divide, precipitation and storms to talk about in the central U.S., then making their way up into either the upper Midwest or the southeast. I'm going to take this trough ridge forecast. This is the 500 millibar height anomalies from the AAFS. I'm quickly taking it into Sunday. This is April 20th, now the 21st. It's hard to see, but that trough just made its way through the Midwest. And then as I get out into, let's do Wednesday afternoon next week. So this is all the way out April 23rd, a 7-day forecast. What we can see here is weak ridging developing across the eastern U.S., likely bringing warmer temps, rebounding temperature trends next week across the eastern U.S. You notice that it's not well defined. We kind of have this what we'll call zonal flow in the jet stream, almost west to east across the U.S. And as we get into late April and early May, there's usually enough moisture in the atmosphere. We've had plenty of rain lately, that this is enough to kind of start to kick off some thunderstorms here off the continental divide that then make their way across the country, either into the Midwest or the Southeast. So that's Wednesday and Thursday. As I take this forecast out late next week, Friday and Saturday, we're getting a bit out in the forecast here, but we can see a better defined trough now over California. Again, that ridging across the western U.S., ridging over Bermuda, likely plenty of Gulf moisture now surging in here in late April. This is all the way out, again, the end of next week. And this would likely be gangbusters here along the central and southern plains with plenty of severe storm conversations to be had, precipitation. Take this forecast forward, likely pushing more of that precip out across the whole central and maybe even the eastern U.S., depending on how much vigor these systems have and if they're able to get through. And kind of see this in the forecast here. I'm going to take this out to, let's do Monday of next week. That'd be April 21st. So we're seeing that system here that we just talked about. You notice I said, between the GFS going toward the southeast, the ECMWF spinning that Sunday, Monday system up into Iowa. The AAFS is kind of right in between, which is a decent forecast. And we see the AAFS do a good job with these here out in that kind of time range. So I'm not surprised to see it between the GFS and the ECMWF. So take this into Wednesday of next week. You can see precipitation signals pick up in the central plains, southern Texas, and then by Thursday, more defined signal now over central Oklahoma and Texas, but then even stretching up into the Midwest on Thursday. Friday and Saturday, potential another system here in the northern plains with kind of the remnants of the previous systems making its way through the Tennessee Valley. And then again, Sunday, April 27th, we're too far out in the forecast for specific details here. But my guess is there's going to be plenty to talk about in terms of rain and storms, potentially severe storms over a corridor that looks like the Tornado Alley to me. Look at the ECMWF ENS, their 8 to 14 day precipitation departures from average. Not a surprise, that same area that we just talked about looking above average through the end of April. So this is going to take us all the way through the 24th to the 30th of the month. And just kind of watching and waiting maybe east of the 90th meridian to see how much of this gets over here into the southeast, how much gets into the upper Midwest. And then I have some questions as how much of this activity persists into the Carolinas and Florida. We're still dealing with some lingering drought here. And if these storms miss to the north or just are too weak to lay down significant precip, this could continue to kind of linger over here in the soil, something we'll have to keep an eye on. Less questions here over the southern plains, and we'll be watching closely to see how far west some of this activity gets. At least the AFS that we just looked at had plenty of rain getting all the way over toward the Texas-New Mexico line, getting out into the end or late next week. Not as surprised to see temperatures over that same time period warm in really the whole eastern 2/3 of the U.S., with that weak troughing trying to move in from the AFS here. A little bit more seasonal temperatures toward the western U.S., but plenty of warmth here toward the end of April, likely over the Midwest when we're starting to think about planting. In terms of those planting windows, with plenty of activity, plenty of these remnant systems moving through the Midwest, I think late next week it's going to be harder to find widespread open windows. Kind of good news is with the low pressure systems moving through with the warmth, we might be able to bring up ET values enough to maybe 2-3 days if we find a break in there. The soils will dry out enough. Now, speaking of those dry soils here, as we're kind of watching and waiting for this activity to pick up, you can see we are still seeing lingering root zone soil moisture deficits here over portions of central Illinois, Iowa, over into portions of the central plains. We've improved the situation down here in the southern plains, but if we get dry again later in May, this is going to pop back up in a big way. And then what I mentioned in the southeast, kind of lingering areas of dryness here that I think if we start missing out in late May, or I should say late April and early May, could pop back up as a concern here. I had this comment mentioned yesterday. Kind of enjoyed this one. They were talking about how the lack of rain delays they were enjoying in the NASCAR races of late, and just kind of looked this up out of curiosity. I mentioned that area of southeast dry concern. We can see here at Bristol, Martinsville, over Darlington. We got Dayton here. or Daytona, and then Homestead. Now, I think Daytona had a rain delay. But nonetheless, on the whole, this region, looking at precipitation deficits over the last 60 days. So, I just tell people, be observant. Look at what's happening, in your daily life. That can tell you what's kind of going on in the weather. So if you notice some good football weather or good race weather, and then not too much rain, if that starts adding up, you might be staring down a bigger concern here, which is drought in this case. Now, if you're getting rained out, it's the opposite concern. So drought numbers, these are just colors on a map. What's actually happening outside, how it's affecting your daily life, that's real drought. That's the kind of thing that we're most interested in, not just the different color bars on the map. So I love comments like that. Keep them coming. If we look over the latest drought monitor map, this will be updated yesterday. Again, you can see some of these areas of concern here lingering in the southern plains, northern plains, a little bit over into the Midwest here, and then mentioned the southeast just a second ago. Now, I want to transition into kind of the long-range conversation here at the end of this video. I think, right, we're looking at quite a bit of activity here. If we think about the precipitation signals that we just showed in the central U.S., not only through this weekend, but even out through the end of April, looked bountiful for the southern plains, maybe even the upper Midwest, getting into the northern plains at times. And that's good news going into a summer where we've had plenty of drought conversation. We've talked about this just about every video here at the end of spring. Now, if we look at the East UMWF, the extended forecast, I'm taking this out through, let's do May 25th here. So this would be April 25th through May 25th. What we see here is, again, that signal for decent precipitation here across the central and southern plains, even getting up into the northern plains, the upper Midwest, trying to get over here into the mid-Atlantic toward New England, and then the southeast, drier here in the western U.S., kind of consistent with maybe a trough here centered across the southwest or the continental divide. Now, what's happening in this map and the forecast here is I think there's some initialization bias, and we've talked about this before, where because out in the 10 to 15 day forecast, we're seeing so much rain here. Not only is just a lot of this kind of green upper or greater than average precipitation simply falling in the first half of this video, the model is kind of tended toward that even later. So I think this paints kind of a rosy picture for May, but it's really more, I think, of an early May signal. And if we scrutinize the model a bit more and just get down into the weekly forecast here, if I go to the 7 day departures from average, early in the periods, this is through May 1st, getting out into early May, now May 11th, can see this activity here. We just saw the activity wane in the southern plains. So I take the forecast further, now getting into late May, see some dry concerns picking up late in the model. And we've seen this in a few other ways. I'm going to take you through that in a second here. Now, looking at the long range, the MJO finally kind of showing some activity here, trying to get out into phase 7 through the end of April here. If we jump over and kind of look at the analogs that we have here and look at, let's do phase 7 and make this a little bit more viewable here. If we look at phase 7, get my cursor back up here, at the end of April and then near the beginning of May, we see this pretty strong signal and some analogs here of ridging across the central and eastern U.S. Now we see that in the forecast here. Showed you those 10 to 15 day temperatures warmer in the eastern U.S. Now, likely looking at some precipitation getting into the central plains, moving through the U.S. here as a result of some of that. So we're kind of consistent here. I think phase 7, looking forward in the forecast. If we jump over and look at this low pass forecast that Eric showed earlier, this is just looking at the MJO kind of as a guide here to see where we might be going. And I'm going to take this forecast. We're now here in late May. I'm going to take this all the way back, if you'll bear with me. Let's take this back to April 16th, where we're at today. And what we see here is just looking at the MJO as a guide here, atmosphere more inclined to troughing in the western U.S., ridging in the eastern U.S. in late April. If I take this forecast forward, you can see that activity still continuing here in the western U.S. This is now April 26th, with ridging here across the eastern U.S. Or the southern U.S. Again, kind of consistent with precipitation getting into the central or northern plains here. We saw that in the forecast. If I take the forecast into the future, early May here, see a much stronger signal for ridging across the eastern U.S. That troughing in the western U.S. remains. This would be a good signal for precipitation in much of the central U.S., I would imagine, warm in the central and eastern U.S. as well. If I take this into mid-May, now kind of curiously, we start to see a trough develop across the Midwest, at least as this low pass forecast suggests. We're way out into the forecast time period now. It's not like we can Sharpie this in or anything. But I'm also noticing something else concerning. We see dominant ridging here, troughing below that near Hawaii. We see dominant ridging here, a big trough just east of that, dominant ridge here over Europe, troughing over Siberia. And it's just a pattern that has, a lack of momentum, a lack of kind of zonal flow through it. It's very meridional. You see this kind of this wave pattern, very meridional. So it's starting to lose momentum here in late April, at least just from this forecast here. And that's a little bit concerning. We kind of naturally lose momentum a bit as we get into May and June. But when I compare that to what I'm seeing here, that is the trade winds over the Pacific here, what we're seeing here is we had plenty of trade wind activity. This is kind of associated with the lingering La Nina here. This kept a lot of the MJO activity further here over the maritime continent in Indonesia. But notice as we go out in the forecast here in late April, we see a lack of those trade winds. We really see a lack of strong signal anywhere across portions of the Pacific here. We see some kind of weakness in those trade winds here, maybe El Nino over here trying to develop a little bit, but really kind of a lack of signal, I think, in the MJO looking out at the Havmullers here. And what we might be seeing, and if you kind of bear with me here, while we saw MJO activity over the maritime continent, what we can see is this MJO is trying to move over the Pacific slowly over the last kind of 20 to 30 days here, looking backwards on this forecast. Now, as it hits the Western and Central Pacific here, you'll notice that activity just kind of peters out, almost dies here. We don't see this kind of consistent signal. We do see this quick movement here across the Central and Eastern Pacific, but this is almost too quick to be the MJO, which leads me to believe that it's one of these Kelvin waves that we've talked about. And I think that kind of muddies the forecast going forward. So where we're going in late April and early May isn't clear on this forecast. I think we're losing some signal here from the MJO, which is not uncommon in May. And without kind of a clear signal from the MJO and some of these forecasts into mid to late May that are kind of now keying in on this trough, leads me to believe, I'm a little concerned, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to take this forecast from the ECMWF. This is the temperature forecast now, 30 days all the way out to May 25th now. So it was kind of an early May signal for cold that we had dismissed for a while in terms of maybe initialization bias with all the rainfall here over the Ohio River Valley. We're now seeing it spring up here and even into late May. So this is 30 days ending on May 25th. And we can see some heat now in the forecast for the southern plains. But if I take this forecast down to 7 days, so now we're looking at late May, May 18th through the 25th, we can see that cold now much more defined here across the upper Midwest, over the Ohio River Valley, into New England, and portions of southern Canada as well. You can see that heat here over the southern plains. So losing a clear signal from the MJO, when we did show that low pass filter forecast, it did have this troughing here over the Midwest and the eastern U.S. It showed that kind of lack of momentum in the atmosphere, showed heat building into the southern plains. And if this is the pattern that we're kind of falling into without clear movement from the MJO to kind of keep things moving, to keep that troughing over the western U.S., which we're kind of seeing here over the end of April and early May, I am worried about some of the heat and drought picking back up in the southern plains. Can't, look at this forecast and say we're going to get this, huge historic late frost in mid to late May, but it is a cold signal here that we'll have to keep an eye on. And then potentially looking at this dryness expanding out from the southern plains. Kind of curiously, if we look over at the GFS forecast, now this is the GFS ensemble, we're also kind of seeing that stopping of that MJO signal here kind of at the forecast point. So down on these is the forecast here. Seeing that Kelvin wave racing through the central and eastern Pacific over the next week here. The GFS kind of tries to reestablish the MJO over the Pacific later in the time period near kind of as we get into May, as the calendar flips. But it's not a clear signal here. So again, kind of lacking a clear signal from the MJO. I think as we get into late May again here on this GFS forecast, if we look at the precipitation anomalies, I'm going to drag this back to early April. There's the activity in the southern and central plains that we're talking about in the near term. Take the forecast into early May. You can see that shift up into the northern plains, the upper Midwest, still kind of lingering here across the southeast. It's actually consistent with this low pass forecast that I showed earlier. As we take the forecast into mid to late May, we shift drier here across portions of the southern plains, really getting more into the mid-south, central plains, and over the Midwest here. So the GFS also kind of has this concerning dryness building in and building up from the south after this flurry of activity here in late April and early May. And I'll pull up the temperatures here from the extended GFS forecast. And again, kind of consistent with that cold across the eastern Corn Belt over into the mid-Atlantic. in New England. Again, at times this was showing up in the late April and early May forecast, I think because of the rainfall we saw in late March and early April. I'm not sure we can say that about this forecast here in mid to late May. This might be a more robust and defined signal because I'm starting to find reasons for it elsewhere, looking across the globe, and at some of the momentum loss that's showing up in the forecast. We also see more aggressive heat now expanding into the continental divide, the central and southern plains here from this GFS forecast. Again, we're way out in the time period. There's certainly accuracy concerns when you're looking at a 30 to 40 day forecast, let alone a 10 to 20 day forecast. So this is not to say, again, that we're going to have this big frost here in mid-May. It's not to say that we're going to totally dry out the second we hit May 10th. But given that we're talking about drought this year getting into May and June and July, our forecasts have showed this just from the Climate Prediction Center for May, June, and July, heat building over the southwest, maybe into the southern plains, and that dryness expanding from the southwest up into the central, southern, and northern plains as we get into the early part of this growing season, at least in those summer months with more precipitation out east. What we're seeing in these long-range forecasts is at least a bit concerningly consistent with our seasonal forecast going into the summer. So enough to kind of keep an eye on here. We'll be looking at that closely. We're likely going to get the next Climate Prediction Center update at the end of this week. So whether it's tomorrow morning when Eric will be back with you, or on Friday, or maybe even Monday, we'll have more to talk about in terms of the seasonal conversation, kind of connecting what we're seeing in the long range with what we're expecting this summer. If you made it to the end of this video here this morning, thanks for watching. Filling in for Eric here today due to some travel, but he will talk with you all tomorrow morning and you get his take on all this. I'll see you again next week.